Chapter 30 of The Knights of the Square Table. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kyle Stadelhofer. The Knights of the Square Table by Seckatary Hawkins. The Secret Room. "Well," said Mr. Jefferson as we came back to the round room on the ground floor of the old stone tower, "I guess we will sit the night out here. It's as good as any place. We have full view of the staircase and the outer door. Perhaps our old man's ghost may walk again later in the night. I'll wager you this time he will not fool us." "He's too slick for us," I said gloomily. "Or else he is a sure enough ghost." "What?" exclaimed Jefferson. "You don't want to admit now that there is such a thing as a ghost, do you, Secretary?" I shook my head warily. "No," I said, "but after all the strange things I've seen in this house, I'm ready to believe that the old man is the nearest thing to a ghost I ever saw." Jefferson laughed. Doc smiled as he chewed his cigar. "Well," said Jefferson, "I've said all I have to say. My business from this minute on is to be silent and watch." I saw that Doc Waters was going to be silent, too. He settled himself for a quiet nap in one of the rickety chairs. Link was like myself, too nervous and frightened to think of sleeping. A half hour passed, one of the quietest half hours I ever spent in my life, awake. And then I stood up and began to walk. I noticed Jefferson look up once and watch me as I paced the little round room. But then he dropped back into his careless attitude and seemed to fall asleep, although I knew that he was only half asleep, like the rabbit, which animal always sleeps with one eye open. Link followed me. His steps were right behind mine. I knew he would stick with me. I walked a few times around the little room, and then out into the broad living room. The more I walked, the braver I seemed to get. I suppose it takes exercise to make a fellow's mind stronger. Anyway, I walked up and down that living room, and the skinny guy was walking right behind me. "Where are you going?" he would ask about every other time I turned around. But if he would have watched me, he would have known that I wasn't going anywhere, just walking up and down to keep myself from thinking about spooks. "Where are you going?" he would ask, and I would never answer him. Yet his question, repeated so often, got me so rattled at last that to keep from hearing his silly talk, I began to count my steps. 1, 2, 3, and so on I counted as I walked, and by the time I reached 16, I was up to the other wall and turning around to walk back. "What you trying to do, Hawkins?" asked the skinny guy at last, as he stopped and watched me walk up and down. "What's the use of wearing yourself out walking like that?" "You don't have to if you don't want to," I said, sort of snappish. "Sit you down in a chair and sleep like Doc and that other man. I've got to walk. I'm nervous, I am." The skinny guy laughed, and then all of a sudden he let out a startled cry that he smothered the next instant with his hand over his mouth. It was the sudden flickering out of the candle on the table in the tower room next to us that plunged the whole place into darkness. It startled me too, for a little, but I hurried over and fumbled around on the tabletop for another candle. Got it and struck a match and lit it, and then I knew that both Doc Waters and Mr. Jefferson were asleep. They hadn't even noticed the candle go out. Maybe Jefferson had, but if so, he pretended to sleep on, maybe to see what we would do. After I lighted the candle and stuck it tight in some of its own grease, I turned back to find the skinny guy walking up and down in the next room as I had. "Hawkins," he said, "do you think the man we saw come into the house is still here?" "Don't ask me," I said, and picking up the electric flashlight, I walked to the outer door and threw it open. Somehow or other, I just had to get out of that house or suffocate. I don't know what it was that made me want to leave, but I knew I needed a breath of fresh air. Skinny guy followed me out. I stood for a moment in the crisp night air, and then with a shiver I turned back into the house. But I didn't go back into the room where Doc and the detective were, no. Somehow or other, I felt stronger, braver now. I started up the stairway. Link was at my heels. Slowly we went up, the creaks of the stairs sounding twice as loud in the stillness of the night. All was dark, save where the little shaft of light from my electric torch pierced the inky blackness. I paused on the threshold and threw my light into every corner. Not a sound, not a thing to be seen. Empty rooms, dusty and grimy. I stood the flashlight on the windowsill, from where it threw its light to the center of the floor, and hardly without noticing what I was doing, I began to pace up and down as I had done in the room below. 1, 2, 3. I could not tell you why I counted my steps. Perhaps because I had been doing that in the room below. I don't know. But I walked up and down and counted my steps silently. 1, 2, 3, and so on. And I came to the other wall when I had counted 12. Suddenly I stopped as I turned. "Link!" I exclaimed, and then I was silent. The skinny guy coughed nervously. The flashlight somehow or other was loosened from its place on the windowsill and tumbled to the floor with a loud noise. The skinny guy cried out. "Hawkins," he yelled, "where are you?" For the light had gone out, and we were in the dark. I hurried over and took hold of Link. "Hush," I said. "Everything's all right. The only thing I was going to say is this. The room below is 16 steps from wall to wall. The room up here, right over the one we were in below, is only 12. You understand what that means, Link?" "No," he said, and I could feel his skinny bones shaking like the dickens. A light came from the door. Doc Waters held it, and behind him was Jeckerson. "I give you credit, Hawkins," said Jeckerson. "You've discovered the old man's hiding place?" "How so?" broke in Doc Waters. He seemed to be still half asleep. "What's up, anyway?" "The room below measures 16 strides," I said. "This one up here is only 12. There's a secret room up here, somewhere." "Hawkins is right," said Jeckerson. "Now, how to get at it is the next question. Light up these candles, boys." We lit a half-dozen candles and placed them at different places in the room, so that the whole room was lighted, although dimly. Then Jeckerson took my flashlight and ran the light all over the walls. "Here," he said, pounding on the wall opposite the door into the round tower room, "is where the room is." And he thumped his hand again and again upon the wall. Suddenly there came a faint, high-pitched voice from beyond the wall. "Who is it? Is it you, boy with the sad face?" We didn't answer. It sounded so hollow, that faint voice, and so ghostly. We couldn't say a word. Jeckerson motioned us back, while he again examined the walls, but he came away shaking his head. "No use trying to find it tonight," he said. "Tomorrow will do. There's a secret about opening a door to this room. Put out these candles and let's get downstairs." We have him safely anyhow, and tomorrow we'll break through that wall. Listen, what is that sound? Like a flash, we had snuffed out all the candles, and Jefferson snapped off the electric torch. We were in darkness. From below came the sound of the door closing, slowly. You could never mistake that sound once you heard it, and we had heard it often enough. For the hinges of the outer door were so rusty that they played a tune every time the door was opened. "Don't breathe a sound," whispered Jefferson, as he held out his arms and shoved us back far from the doorway. Steps were sounding on the stairs, light steps and quick. Although it was dark in the room, we could still see the darker shape that flitted quickly through the door into the room, and turning to the left, stood in front of the wall, from behind which had come the faint voice. He seemed to be unaware that anyone else was there beside him, and suddenly he stooped, and then right afterward a square of the wall swung outward, and a flood of light came streaming through the opening. And in the opening was the old man with the lantern. He held it out of the opening in the wall, and there was a smile upon his withered face. The dark figure that had come up the steps came forward into the light, and I saw it was a boy. I knew him. The boy with the scar. I could tell by the way he wore his hat pulled down low over his eyes. "I brought you your supper," said the boy with the scar, holding out the parcel to the old man. "You must be terribly hungry by now." "Oh," said the old man with a smile, "I don't need much, sonny. You're so good to an old man." The boy with the scar pretended not to hear him. The old man's look turned to one of sadness as he shook his head. "It never grows," he said. "Always one, every time. I bring one." "Did you go over there tonight?" asked the boy quickly. "Yes, I was there," answered the old man, "but I left only one. There was no more." The boy with the scar lifted his hand and shook his head impatiently. "That'll do, Grandpop," he said. "It's all I wanted to know. Something funny's going on." Then, without another word, he turned swiftly and left the old man. We heard his footsteps clattering down the rickety stairs, as though he weren't afraid of ghosts. The outer door closed with its old, familiar, rusty tune. The old man stood unmoving in the doorway, listening to the sounds of the retreating boy. But before he had time to close the door, Jefferson was before him. He shoved himself between the old man and the open door. The old man gave a cry of surprise and sudden fright. "Who are you?" he screamed. "What do you want here? Who are you?" "Come now," said Jefferson soothingly in a low voice, patting the old man upon the shoulder. "We are your friends. We've come to help you, sir. Look, these friends I have with me. See, they are all your friends." He gazed with glassy eyes as Doc and the skinny guy and I followed Jefferson into the secret room. As soon as his eyes fell upon me, however, his face lit up with a smile. "Oh, Seckatary Hawkins," he cried. "I know. Yes, you are friends. He helped me once, helped me as God knows I was helping somebody else." I stepped up to him and held up my hand. "Mr. Galerio," I said, "I'm glad to see you again. Can we help you?" He took my hand in his bony fingers and pressed it, just like he did that night when I read for him the faded letter. "Perhaps," he said weakly, "perhaps you can help, though I don't know." He passed his shaking hand before his eyes and sank into a chair beside the little table. And it was then that I noticed what a queer room it was, as narrow as a packing case. No windows, only 3 little ventilators in the ceiling, and yet crowded with bookshelves, filled with musty-looking volumes of olden days, colors faded and edges ragged. The old man was crying. He had his withered face buried in his bony hands, but we could hear his whimpering. "All over," he whimpered, "trying to fix it right, but too late now. All over now." Jefferson put his big arm around the little old man. "You did your best, old man," he said. "Everything will turn out all right. The only mistake you made was hiding yourself in this secret room. You should have come right to me. Look at my face. Have you ever seen me before?" The old man raised his eyes and gazed into the brown eyes of Jefferson, and then he started back. "By the Jehovah," he said, "you're one of the 2 tramps who lived in this house." "I played the part of a tramp," said Jefferson with a smile, "just to try and find out what you were doing here. But you were too slick for me, Mr. Grellario. You'll have to hand it to young Seckatary Hawkins here for figuring out where your hiding place was." The old man turned his eyes upon me, and this time they were not friendly. "You," he exclaimed, pointing his bony finger at me. "You promised to keep my secret." "I never knew of this secret room," I broke in. But Jefferson cut me short. "Come," he said, "we must explain this whole matter to Judge Granbury. Let us go to his office at once," which we did. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of The Knights of the Square Table. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Knights of the Square Table by Seckatary Hawkins. The Boy with the Scar. When we found out that the ghost in the lonely house was really an old man and not a ghost at all, believe me, every boy in our club was just as glad as I was. I don't like to believe in ghosts, and I'm always so glad when I can prove that what the other fellows think is a ghost is nothing but a real live person after all. I expected to get a call from Judge Granbury to come up and tell what we knew about the old man in the lonely house, but on the day after we made our discovery, Doc Waters came down to our clubhouse, and after the meeting was over, he followed me into my writing room while the other boys went out to skate on the frozen river. "Well, Hawkins," he said, "your old man has been taken to the hospital in Watertown. They say he is crazy, but I'm not so sure. How much do you think was in that 1 bag of gold coins we found in the cellar of the old mill, where he had hidden it?" "How much?" $1,027, and if we can believe the old man, there was about $100,000 hidden away in that whole house." "How can you tell?" "Well, you told me that the old man was there about 3 months. Jefferson says that's about right. It tallies with the disappearance of the old man from his home in Watertown, according to the information. Well, that's about 90 days. The old man says he has been putting away a sack of gold each night, hiding it under the mill." 90 sacks? Ye understand? Golly Moses, I broke in. Where did it all go to? "We only found the 1 bag of gold. That's what I'm coming to, if you'll give me time," said Doc. "Of course. Those smart doctors from Watertown say the old man is crazy. They say he carried the same sack each night, and imagine he was carrying another sack each night. But he tells Mr. Jefferson and me that he took 1 sack from the hidden room each night to the mill, and hid it, yet each time he came to find the hiding place empty. Of course, he's a little off his noodle. He couldn't understand why the pile of sacks didn't grow. The great doctors from Watertown said he never had but 1 sack and—" "But we saw him take it there," I broke in again excitedly, "and we found it." "Yeah," said Doc, "and believe me, Hawkins, he brought about 90 more sacks of gold into that old mill, and they disappeared. Take it from me, there was a fortune in that old lonely house. The question is, where did it go?" I glanced up quickly at Doc's eyes, then catching him look, I nodded. "I know," I said. "I know what you're driving at now. You think I can tell you? You got a sneaking notion somewhere back in your head that I know who took those bags of gold out of the old mill after the man put them there each night. Well, I'll tell you the truth, as I always do, Doc. I don't know." Doc got up. And if you did know, he said, it happened to be somebody you had promised not to tell. I guess you keep your word. I looked at him square in the eye. I looked at him hard, and he returned the look with a little smile about his lips. And then he went out, and he closed the door softly behind him. Left alone, I sat dreaming. What an awful mess we boys were always getting into. And all the time the worries were left to me. All the time I was given the job of setting things right. Always there was trouble in our town, and whenever there was, the trouble was sure to drift down until it came around to our old clubhouse on the river bank. And we boys got tangled up in it, and then it was nobody but myself who was expected to figure a way out of it. Ah well, I smiled. What difference? We had come through many troubles, but always in the end we had come out all right. Many times we had been under suspicion, but always had proven ourselves worthy of Judge Granbury's trust. He called us his junior police. By the saints! We would still prove to him that we were true blue, and with that thought in mind, I threw my worries to the winds and started to write minutes of the day's meeting. I scribbled in my book for half an hour, I guess. I'm a slow writer, but I like to write, and the time passes quickly when I have my pen in my hand. The little old brass clock ticked away, and the ticks sounded loud. Once in a while, I could hear the whistle of an ice-locked steamboat on the river, and then, all of a sudden, I felt as though I were not alone. I looked out the corner of my eye without raising my head, and I saw there was somebody standing between the curtains and my doorway. I went on writing as though I didn't notice, but a soft voice brought me around suddenly. Seckatary Hawkins, it said, and the sound was soft and mellow, like velvet. I slowly lifted my pen from the page and turned my eyes upon the doorway. Well, I said, and what do you want? It was Rags, the boy with the scar, who once belonged to Pooley's gang. He had his broad hat drawn low upon his forehead, so that only the lower half of his face was to be seen. He carried in his arms a number of bags. By Jove! They were the same kind of bags that we had seen the old man carry out of the lonely house. "I've come to ask you something," said the boy with the scar. "You have always been nice to me. I kind of feel like you would help me out. So you're in trouble, eh?" "Might have known it. Nobody ever comes to me lest they're in trouble and want to help 'em out. Don't you think I get tired of that sort of thing, boy? Why should I help you now, for instance?" He smiled. "You're always helping somebody, that's right," he said. "But I ain't asking you to help me this time. I can get along, but look here." He stepped forward with his armful of bags and dumped them all before me upon my desk. "I'm asking you to help me some of those other fellows this time," he said, and voice was so soft, so kind, that my heart melted right then and there. "I'm asking you to help me give this gold." "Gold!" I broke in. "Yeah, gold money that don't belong to me. It belongs to an old man that used to live in the old lonely house up on the creek." "Ah," I said, "so you are the one who's been taking these bags away every night after the old man put them in the old mill? Is that right, Rags?" He winced when I said Rags. He made a motion as if he would raise his hand, but he stepped back and put his hands behind him. "Count 'em," he said simply. I counted the bags. There were 13. Once he had fallen upon its side and spilled its yellow pieces upon my desk. "Just 13," said the boy with the scar. "That tells you just how many days I've been taking these bags out of the old mill after the old man put 'em there. Each night he brought one bag to the mill. Each night I come up and got it as soon as he went away. I nodded my head, and for a moment didn't say a thing. The boy with the scar looked at me anxiously. "You don't think I stole 'em for myself, do you, Hawkins?" he asked. I smiled. "No," I said. "And if you had, you wouldn't have brought them here tonight, Rags, because you're not going to take 'em away from here when you go. Ye understand? I want you to give 'em to the old man," he said. "You was with that detective fellow when the old man in the lonely house was caught. You know where he is. I've been searching all over. I can't find out. But you can find 'em. You will give 'em these bags. Tell him it's all I could say for him. Tell him it's from the boy with the sad face. He used to call me that. The boy with the scar broke off in a sob and turned away from me. I felt a sudden pull at my old heartstrings. This poor kid with the marked-up face was a good scout after all. I stepped up to him where he stood with his back turned to me, and I put my arms around his shoulders and patted him on the back. "Buck up here," I said. "You're with an old friend of yours now, Rag." At that he turned suddenly, but as quickly he pulled his hat lower upon his face and turned away again, as though he were afraid to let me see his face. At the time I thought it was because he felt touchy about the scar on his face. It was an ugly, disfiguring welt that would have turned one's heart sick to see, but only his chin being in view, one did not quite get the impression of it when he gave his whole face was exposed, as it found out later on. It was a good 10 minutes I had with him to get him to stop crying. I wondered what was going on in his mind. Then later on I understood, but now I couldn't. "I will see to it that the old man gets his gold," I said. "Believe me, boy, I think a whole lot of you. You could have run away with his money and spent it and I could have had a good time. I think you are a square and fair fellow for bringing it." "Fair and square," he broke in. "That's what he used to say." "Who, the old man?" "No, him I liked so well, Pooley. And yet he was the one I saw stealing this old man's gold every night. He would leave his nights of the square table gang. He would sneak off alone and go to the old mill and get the sack of gold money that the old man brought there." "Hold on," I broke in roughly. "Pooley wouldn't have done that. It must have been a long Tom." "No, it was Pooley," said the boy with the scar. "No use. I tried to believe different too. I didn't want to think that Pooley did it. I liked Pooley so much. But I saw him, Hawkins, I saw him take it, night after night, and then I felt sorry for the poor old man, and I always got there before Pooley did, and I got the bag each night for 13 nights. 13 bags, almost 2 weeks, and then came the night you and Skinny Guy and those 2 men followed the old man. That was the last. After he stopped talking, I couldn't say a word because I was too surprised and shocked beyond words. I was thinking a heap, though. Pooley a thief? Pooley, leader of magnificent knights of the square table? A thief? No! I couldn't believe it. Surely there must have been a mistake. It must have been Long Tom. There was a bunch of noise outside, our boys returning from their skating frolic on the frozen river. Shadow Loomis and the Skinny Guy led them. They came trooping into the meeting room, which was dark for it had grown late. Seeing the light in my writing room, they broke in upon us, as I hurriedly took my seat in front of my desk. "Ah!" cried Shadow Loomis, seeing the boy with the scar. "Shadow," said the boy with the scar, stepping forward. Both his hands were extended. It was the most friendly show a fellow would want, but Shadow snared him away. "Get back!" shouted Shadow. "You measly coward! You wouldn't fight me when you had the chance, would you? When you had all the odds on your side and everything in your favor, you wouldn't fight me, would you? You measly coward! And I guess you think I won't fight you now, 'cause you're in my clubhouse, and all my chums are around me, eh?" "I'd never fight you, Shadow," said the boy with the scar. "The day you hit me, I wouldn't fight you, because—" "Shut up!" cried Shadow, and I could see that he was mad. "Shut up and put your fists because—" But here's where I stepped in. I saw the boy with the scar shrink back into a corner, pulling his broad hat over his face as he did so. I stepped between him and Shadow. "Just one moment," I said. "I'm secretary of this club. If I don't amount to any more, you might as well take my name off your list, and I'll shake hands goodbye all around. I'm going to see that this boy gets out of this clubhouse safely, even if I have to fight you, Shadow Loomis." Shadow fell back as if I had struck him. Nothing could have surprised him more, but I stood firm, and the next thing I knew, Dick Ferris, our captain, stepped between me and Shadow. "Boys," he said, "we always get along well by following Seckatary Hawkins. Let's stick to him now." Then came a cheer from every boy in the club except Shadow. I waited for Shadow, but he wouldn't join. However, I walked to the door and drew upon it wide. "Go, Rags," I said to the boy with the scar. He gave Shadow one last look. It wasn't a look of anger, nor a hard feeling of any kind, but rather of pity and regret. And then he started toward me, where I held the door. As he passed me, I felt a certain feeling as though I had known this boy long ago. I caught his arm. "Let me see your face," I said. But he pulled his hat down closer over his face and beat down my hand. "No," he said. "No, Seckatary Hawkins, not yet." And with that, then he was out of the door and swallowed up in the gloom. There was a strange silence in the clubhouse after he had left. One by one, the boys went home. Shadow, the first to leave, followed by Robbie Hood. At last, there were only two of us there, Dick Ferris and I. After explaining the whole thing to Dick, I pointed to the bags on the table. "We can't leave them here, Hawkins," he said. "We'd better bring them to Doc Waters' office," which we did. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of The Knights of the Square Table. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kyle Stadelhofer. The Knights of the Square Table by Seckatary Hawkins. The Secret of the Cave. We held our meeting next day, right after school. It was the quietest meeting I ever knew. Seemed like all the boys in the club were afraid to say a word. As soon as the meeting ended and the boys went out to play, I went to my writing desk to write the minutes, while Perry began to busy himself with the straightening up. And believe me, after a meeting of a dozen boys in one clubhouse, there is plenty of straightening up and cleaning to be done. "Begging your pardon, sir," began Perry, but I cut him short. "Perry," I said in a soft voice, and smiling as kindly as I know how, "when will you ever forget that sir business? Can you talk to me like the rest of the boys? Why use that sir all the time? You're one of the club now." "I know it, sir," he said with a smile, "but somehow it sounds good to talk that way, Hawkins. I like to be polite and kind, sir. It makes me feel so much better. If I couldn't be that way, sir, I wouldn't want to live at all. Might as well be dead, I say to myself, as not to be kind and polite to everybody. It gives me some kind of pleasure that maybe you wouldn't get by being that way, sir." I laughed. "You mean I'm rough and ready, eh, Perry?" I said. "I know I'm not just as nice as I ought to be, perhaps." "No, no, sir, not that," he broke in. "But you don't understand my way of looking at it, sir. You're Hawkins, that's enough. But you, sir, can't see things like I see 'em, sir. I hope you won't say any more about it, sir." I shook my head as he went about his business, and I started to write the minutes in my book. Hardly had I written 5 lines when there was such a commotion outside that I laid my pen down hurriedly and ran to the curtains that hung in the doorway to the meeting room. I saw the outer door flung open. A group of boys shoved an unwilling member into the meeting room, and he fell upon his hands and knees before the table. "Fellas," I yelled, "what's all this roughhouse mean?" They were all my own boys, all but the one they shoved forward. He was Pooley, leader of the Knights of the Square Table, who had signed a peace with me, his gang never to fight mine anymore, and he was always fair and square. "Ask him what it means," yelled Jerry Moore, our tallest and roughest member. "Yeah, let the Square Table guy answer for himself," shouted Shadow Loomis, the boy in whom I always trusted most, whom I always credited with the most common sense. "Let him tell you where we caught him and what we caught him with." "We caught him with the goods," shouted the skinny guy. "Ask him about the gold, Hawkins, about the gold, you know what I mean." Pooley had drawn himself up straight, stood proudly, his arms folded, his eyes showing defiance. "I'll tell him," he said quietly. "I'll tell him without his asking me. I'm not ashamed of anything I did, and I'm not afraid of any of you single-handed, and some of you 2 by 2. They would have jumped him, all except the skinny guy for that last crack. But I stood between him and the crowd. 'Stand back,' I said, 'and let's give a chance to a fella who is always fair and square.' They glared at me, but they were excited, mad, and they stood waiting for a signal from one or the other to rush Pooley in spite of my words. But I stood fast, and I held up my hand, and Pooley spoke. 'Hawkins,' he said, 'there's been enough trouble around here and Banklick Creek, especially around the lonely house and the old mill. I'm caught today on your ground, up on your cliffs. You see what they have there.' For the first time I noticed, as he pointed to it, the bag that Shadow Loomis carried. 'Look here,' cried Shadow, 'a bag of coin. Money, Hawkins, money as we seldom see. And this guy has it hidden all in our old cliff cave, 50 bags of it, or I'm a monkey.' 'You're an ape,' broke in Pooley, with just the shadow of a smile, 'for there's 87 bags of it.' 'Stolen,' Jerry Moore interrupted him. 'From the old haunted mill,' chimed in the skinny guy. 'I'm spy of our gang. You didn't know that, did you, Pooley? I saw you goin' and comin', and I followed you a nights, and I didn't tell even Hawkins.' He was excited now, or he wouldn't have told me either. But when he saw that he had given it away, he came forward to me. 'This is the guy who's been watching the old man come out of the lonely house every night. He watched, and soon's the old man went away, he got the sack of gold and took it to his hiding place, which is in our old cliff cave, where the stoner's boy used to hide. Same place. It's stacked with bags of these gold pieces, Hawkins. This Pooley fella stole 'em, every one.' 'And who had a better right?' broke in Pooley in a loud voice. You skinny bones. You think it's mighty smart to spout like you do about what kind of a good spy you are and what you know, but just what do you know? Do you know that that money belongs to me by right? Or do you not? I ask you that question.' Our boys all stood around. They stepped back a pace. They stood silent. 'Or do you, smart Shadow Loomis,' continued Pooley, 'do you know what's kept me from breaking your nose many times when I saw you get so flip? No? Don't answer. I know you can't. All right, let me talk a little. You've got me cornered here now, when I haven't a single of my own gang around me. Yet I tell you this, that if my whole gang of Knights of the Square Table were with me, I'd make 'em all go away, so I could tell you and your whole bunch face to face, who's got a better right to that gold than I have.' Nobody answered him. He looked around from one to the other, and then, when his eyes met mine, and he saw my look, which was of sympathy for the old leader of the Square Table Boys, he gave a sob, and sinking into the chair beside the pine table, he bowed his head upon his arm and shook while he cried out like as if his heart was broken. I couldn't stand it. I went over to him. I put my arm around his sturdy shoulders. 'Poor old Pooley.' 'You always did the best by me, Pooley,' I said softly. 'Let the others go. If they want to stand against you now, it's time they begin to pick another secretary of their club. Look up at me, and say you believe me.' But Pooley wouldn't look up, although his hand reached around and took mine and held it. There was a silence, broken only by the sobs of Pooley, his bowed head upon the table. 'What's all that fuss?' It was a new voice that broke in, a man's voice, Doc Waters. I saw him standing in the open doorway as I looked up. 'We found the thief,' began Shadow Loomis, but I cut him short. Pooley had a raw deal, I said. The boys found all that money, Doc. The lonely house gold? Yes, 87 bags of it, in the old cliff cave. Good Lord, let's remove it at once. No, wait. Better send for Lord Granbury himself, and the sheriff. I'll not have anything to do with it. Who can go? I sent little old Perry Stokes, my most faithful friend, and he took it as an honor to go. Just to show you how gold will act, it didn't take 10 minutes to bring both the judge and the sheriff to the clubhouse. With a little explanation, we started for the cliff cave. As we approached the cavern led by Pooley himself, Doc and the sheriff talking earnestly together, I caught sight of a figure coming out of the mouth of Cliff Cave. For an instant only was he to be seen, but enough to tell me that it was Rags, the boy with the scar. How strange, thought I, that we should all be meeting here, Doc, Judge, and the sheriff, all of our gang, Pooley, and the boy with the scar. What was that? Cried the sheriff. None of us answered. I flew along on swift feet now. I made for the head of the path, where the dark mouth of the cave faced us. I pulled out my pocket flash lamp and lit my way, but I could hear the rest of the bunch at my heels. Into the dark tunnel I ran, the same dark passage through which we had chased Stoner's boy so many times. Patter, patter, patter came the sound of the feet behind me. Once or twice I caught the sound of the voice of Doc or the sheriff, but never did I listen nor pause. On I ran until I came to a dead stop, stood stock still staring at a sight that I never will forget. It was a sight. You might remember that there is, in the cliff cave, a deep pit, a split in the rocky floor, over which Stoner's boy used to swing upon a rope to get to his hiding place. While upon the other side of this deep pit, beside a great pile of sacks, stacked on top of one another, stood a figure with a flaming torch, waving it wildly back and forth, and shouting to us in a loud voice that echoed back its sound. Stop where you are. Nobody will get this money. I'm going to see that it goes to where it belongs, so long as I got my grandpop. The voice died out there. Our flashlights flickered, flashes flitting across one another, making the place seem ghostly. The flame of the torch in the boy's hand across the chasm shot high against the glistening rocks, and suddenly it wavered, then began to sink. And with a piercing cry, the boy who held that flaming torch began to fall. Oh, poor boy, how he fell! Swiftly like a plummet, down, down, down. I covered my face in my hands to blot out the sight. Oh, heaven, I have never wanted to see that again. Years before, I had seen one other go down into the dark, dark space, one Stoner's boy, and now I knew who it was. Back, came Doc Waters' voice. And back, I cried loudly. Back, everybody. Link Lambert, and Shadow Loomis. We three. Doc, we three. We know the way. Let us go, let us go. They let us go. They were too stunned to move, but I could hear the skinny guy's feet behind me as I ran, and behind him came Shadow. I led the winding way, down through those awful ghostly holes into the very bottom of the cliff, where ran the cave river, and there we found him. Yeah, it was Rags, the boy with the scar. He had slipped from his dangerous position on the edge of the treacherous precipice. He had fallen, as Stoner had fallen, into the deep, dark pit. But, unluckily for him, he had not struck the water of the cave river as Stoner had. No. He had landed plump upon the stony banks of this underground stream. And as I bent over him, I could see that the life was knocked out of him. He was going. Hawkins, he whispered as I bent over him. Dear old Hawkins, I'll never see you again, boy. But I'm glad you're here. Tell him, tell him, tell him I did it for him. Tell him I'll forgive him, as I hope he will forgive me. And tell my dad. But I never heard what he wanted me to tell his dad. No. But I made up a lot of good things that I thought he wanted to tell, and that's what I told. But before he could really tell me, the boy with the scar stopped speaking. Doc Waters brushed me aside, and I remember that I fell upon my knees and buried my face in my hands, and you can believe me, boys, I cried. Why? You ask me why? Because I'm soft-hearted, I guess. He is dead, said Doc Waters. Judge Granbury stepped up and looked at the poor little figure that lay upon the cold rocks of that underground place. Then he took off his hat. We all did. Shadow Loomis looked puzzled. He stepped forward, but I caught him. Shadow. But he wouldn't listen to me. He stepped forward. The boy with the scar lay still upon his back, and his broad-brimmed hat was gone. There, within full view for the first time, lay the face. And as the flashlights of our crowd played upon it, there came a sobbing cry from Shadow. John, he cried. John. And then again, before I could get to him, he cried out, It's my own brother, John, the Rolling Stone. Ah, boy, how he cried then, how I cried too. I'm soft-hearted, but if I was the stoniest-hearted boy on earth, I would have cried then, when I saw Shadow Loomis stooped over his fallen brother and cry his heart out, because why? Because he had treated him so shamefully when he lived. Now that he was dead, Shadow felt the dreadful pain of genuine remorse. Poor little Rags. Poor boy with the scar. He had traveled much. He was a Rolling Stone. How he had come by this terrible scar on his face, which disfigured him so that even his own brother couldn't recognize him. All that would remain a mystery now and forever. And poor old Shadow Loomis. It was Judge Granbury who finally got us started away from the solemn place, that eerie spot that seemed to be haunted ever since Stoner's boy had his headquarters there. None of us boys were allowed to stay. Judge Granbury and Doc Waters stayed and took care of that poor, broken little body with the scarred face that we had known as Rags, but the sheriff herded us together and made each of us carry a few sacks of the gold that was hidden this side of the pit, and bring it up to Judge Granbury's office, which we did. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Knights of the Square Table. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kyle Stadelhofer. The Knights of the Square Table by Seckatary Hawkins. Pooley makes good. Today was the first day we didn't hold a meeting in our little clubhouse on the riverbank. The first day we missed for more than a year. We didn't even go to school today. And every boy had his daddy along with him when we did meet, up in the judge's office that he uses for a courtroom. It was the strangest meeting we boys ever attended, and, believe me, I shall never forget it as long as I live. This court, said Judge Granbury, intends not to prosecute, but to investigate. A charge has been brought against the boy called Pooley. This charge nobody was willing to bring, so the sheriff made it out against the boy. to it for stealing certain monies said to have been taken from an old place known as Lonely House, up on Banklick Creek. I hope all of you understand this perfectly. He stopped speaking, while he let his gaze wander slowly around the crowd. I guess everybody there understood perfectly because nobody said anything. Very well. Sheriff, bring up the boy. Pooley leaped to his feet before the sheriff could move. I saw his father try to hold him, but Pooley was too quick. He stood before the judge's desk. Here I am, Judge, he said quietly. Judge Granbury glared over the rims of his eyeglasses. So, he said, slowly nodding his head. So you are the young villain who stole all that money, eh? You don't look like a thief. But then, I have learned from experience in the courtroom that one never can tell by appearances. Do you know what those bags contained? How much gold there was all counted up? Do you know just how much you stole, boy? Not a cent. Pooley's reply came like a shot. His voice was clear and unafraid. The judge sat back in his chair and glared at him. What? He exclaimed, then turning to the sheriff. Did you hear that, Sheriff? I hope he did, spoke up Pooley. I want to have this privilege, Your Honor. I want to tell just what I know about this gold. Oh, that isn't the only thing, broke in the judge, shaking his finger before Pooley's face. You've been a great source of annoyance to me, young fellow. You took it into your head that you could go around frightening the boys of our town, didn't you? You thought the boys in the little clubhouse on the riverbank would be afraid of you and your rowdy gang because you all rode around on ponies, eh? Tell me, please, if you can, where did you get the ponies, eh? You bought them with gold that you took out of some of the bags that you stole out of the lonely house, didn't you? There was something in Judge Granbury's voice that made me doubt his sincerity. And when I looked again in his eyes, I felt as though the judge did not mean to be as nasty as his words would lead one to believe. He was trying Pooley. But before Pooley could answer, his father had stood up. I beg leave to make explanation there, said Pooley's dad. The ponies that my boy used were not bought by him, Your Honor. I run the pony track up at the summer park. Out of season, my boy takes care of the ponies for me. And he does that work well. He and his pals were using my ponies, Judge. Judge Granbury nodded, satisfied. All right, Mr. Poole, he said. Since you are testifying now, suppose you tell us what your boy means when, in spite of the fact that we all know he took the bags of gold out of the lonely house, he still says he did not steal a cent. Pooley's daddy shook his head. I cannot explain that, he said. But I can, spoke up Pooley. My father doesn't know, and it wouldn't do him much good if he did, because the money isn't his. It's mine, you see? Where's Seckatary Hawkins? Is he here yet? I stood up and waved my hand once. I'm here, Pooley, I said, and then I sat down again next to my daddy, who was terribly embarrassed about me getting mixed up again in a court case. But Pooley was satisfied. Judge, he continued, I got proofs that I didn't steal a cent of that money. You admit that you put those bags of gold in the cliff cave, don't you? Asked Judge Granbury. Yes, but it was all mine, Judge. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom between Pooley's last words and the judge's next question. Can you prove it? Yes, answered Pooley, quickly and tugging inside his shirt. He brought forth a bundle of yellow faded papers. Here, Judge, he said. Here is the proof. Read it yourself. I cannot write good enough to tell you how I felt, how everybody in the courtroom felt when the old judge read the faded papers that Pooley handed to him. It was 5 minutes before the judge spoke again. "Tell me how you came by these papers, boy," he said in a low voice. "Well, Judge, I had a gang. It was called the Knights of the Square Table, and we had our headquarters in the old lonely house. I had to be careful, Judge, because my dad told me always to stay away from that lonely house. But it was a good place for my gang to meet, Your Honor, and one day I discovered a notch in the wall upstairs, in the room next to the tower, and I put my thumb in it, and it pressed something, and a door swung open, and I went into the room. It was a secret room, Your Honor, and I found these papers. You see what it says on the papers. Not to Laura B. Poole should the money go, but to his son, if he ever has one. That's the way the papers read, Judge. You saw it for yourself." "Well, sir, Laura B. Poole is my father's name, and I'm his only son, you see. So I figured it out right away that it was my money if I ever could find it." "Well, you found it, didn't you?" "No, Judge, the old man found it, but I got it all away from him. All but a few sacks that my pal got when he found out I was fooling the old man. If I did wrong—" "Just a moment," broke in Judge Granbury. "Let your daddy explain this. Mr. Poole, just what is the truth of all this?" Pooley's dad looked sad. He rose slowly from his chair and advanced a few steps. "The boy told you the truth," he began in a low voice. "My name is Larrabee Poole. My father lived in the lonely house. He never liked me, Your Honor, and sent me away when I was a little chap. He put me in a school where I was treated like an orphan. I knew, when I grew older, that he had plenty of money, but never did I dream that there was so much. When I realized how unkind he had been, I swore never to go near him or the house again. I have kept my word to this day, and I don't want a penny of that money. If those papers are genuine and legal, and if they give this wealth to my boy, it is all right. I want him to have it. He's been a good boy, Judge. He wouldn't take a thing that didn't belong to him. I know my boy." As he stopped speaking, he turned toward Pooley, and their eyes met. There was a happy expression on Pooley's face, but his father's eyes were wet. And he turned his face after a moment and brushed his lashes with his kerchief. The judge coughed and said, "Yes." At that moment I saw Doc Waters step hurriedly into the hall. He came back almost immediately with Mr. Jeckerson, and between them walked the old man who had lived in the lonely house for 3 months. Every eye in the courtroom turned upon the old bent figure as he shuffled forward between the two men. He seemed not to notice the crowd of people that had gathered in the room. But all of a sudden he gave a little cry, and pulling away from Doc and Jeckerson, he bobbled over to Pooley's daddy and clutched his arm. "Larry!" he cried in a cracked voice. "I've been looking all over for you. Larry, for 20 years. For 20 years. I saw Pooley's daddy reach out and catch the old man. There was a shadowy smile upon his face as he patted the old man's shoulder. "Gralerio," he said softly, "and I didn't want you ever to find me, Gralerio. It's all over. Let's let the dead past sleep. You are a grand old man. You haven't changed at all since I was a little boy, and you took me round with you when you worked for my father, and he was too busy for me. He never liked me, Gralerio. That is why I never wanted to see him again. That is why I never wanted you to find me, you see." The old man's face was happy, but the deep wrinkles that ran like furrows upon his skin were filled with flowing tears as he patted the hand of Pooley's daddy. He was about to speak again, when the judge spoke, "This court is adjourned. All of you who have no business here had better get out and leave us. This case is settled." What they did in that courtroom after that, I never knew. I went right home with my dad, and he gave me an awful lecture on the subject of keeping out of trouble. Suspicion, he said, was almost as bad as being charged with something, only that when you are charged and you're not guilty, you've got a chance to prove it, while if somebody has a suspicion against you, there's no way to remove it, because 9 times out of 10, you don't even know you're suspected, and those who suspect just keep their thoughts to themselves. But my pop knows that I'll take care of myself, so I said goodbye to him. He had to go up to his office again, and I walked slowly down to the little old clubhouse on the riverbank, intending to write down in this book just what I could remember took place in the courthouse. I thought I'd be all alone, but when I came in sight of the clubhouse, I saw a boy waiting for me on the steps of the porch. It was Shadow Loomis. "Hello, Hawkins," he said in a weak voice, and I could tell by the red around his eyes that he had not yet stopped thinking about his poor old Rolling Stone brother John, who had fallen to his death in the cliff cave pit. "I've been waiting here for you an hour. I just couldn't come to that courthouse. Everything has gone wrong, it seems. The world looks upside down to me." "Oh, cheer up, Shadow," I said, unlocking the door. "Come in and talk a while." When I had lit the lamp on my desk, and we were seated facing each other, he opened up. "You're the only boy I can talk to now, Hawkins," he said. "I think I got a lot to answer for the way I treated John, poor fella, dead." "I can't believe it, Hawkins. Seems like it can't be." I sighed. "Shadow," I said, "someday you're going to find out that this world is full of 2 things, good and evil. You're going to find out that no matter what we do, good and evil is going to have a hand in it. And sometimes the good wins, and sometimes the evil gets the best of it. It's just the same way with you and poor old John. I know how you feel. I always told you John was all right, but you wouldn't believe me. Why? Because the evil in your mind was stronger than the good. God knows these things best, Shadow, and He takes care to see that we learn our lesson. I don't want to rub it in, boy. You've been a good friend of mine. But I wish you would see. Somebody's coming." There was a step outside. The curtains parted, and one of our boys hesitated in the doorway. "Ah, it's you, Herb," I said. "Come on in. Shadow and I were just talking about—" Herb Acom stepped in and allowed the curtains to fall together behind him. "About him?" he asked with a little jerk of his head. "I thought so. I wanted to come and tell you, and I'm glad Shadow is here too. About Rags, I mean, the boy with the scar. My brother," broke in Shadow, with a little catch in his voice. "I didn't know he was your brother," said Herb, "although I might have known. You see, he did me a good turn once, and I never forgot. I promised I'd do anything for him in turn, and what do you think he asked of me?" We both shook our heads. "He asked," continued Herb, "that I keep my eyes on Shadow Loomis. And when at a given signal which only he and I understood, he would be waiting in the forest. I was to come and answer any questions he might ask about you. I always did. He always asked how you were getting along. He always wanted to know whether or not you had said anything about him. And every time I told him you hadn't, he seemed so disappointed. And he always made me promise that I would see that not one of Pooley's gang ever hurt you. Now, I've told you all that I think I have to tell. I wanted it off my chest. I didn't know he was your brother then, not until after he fell into the cave pit. But I wanted you to know that he was a true blue brother to you, Shadow. Shadow sprang up and caught Herb's hand. You don't know how much I appreciate that, Herb, he said. Perhaps I'll be able sometime to pay you back. But Herb waved him back and shook his head. No, he said, for tonight I resigned from the club. I only stayed to do what I promised him I'd do, and besides, I brought a lot of trouble on this clubhouse. If I hadn't come, Pooley's gang would never have had it in for you boys. So I guess I'd better be going. My papa is sending me to St. Allen's College. I asked him to. Maybe next summer when I come back. Poor old Herb. He didn't want to go away. I could see that. He couldn't talk further. He gave us one swift look, and then, with a sharp salute of his right hand, he turned and went swiftly out. For a minute there was a silence as I opened my book and began to write. Shadow thrust his hands into his pockets and walked over to the window. There came from the river the deep sound of a steamboat whistle. River's thawed out, Hawkins, said Shadow, without turning from the window. There goes the Hudson Lee. Yeah, I said, without stopping my writing. Spring'll be on the way soon now. It's the last freeze that's thawing. My pen went scratching across the page, line after line. Finally, I heard Shadow move from the window. The next minute, his hand was upon my shoulder. Hawkins, he said, we've come pretty close to losing our clubhouse again. And what was the cause? The cliff cave, I said. When Stoner's boy went down into the pit, we lost our clubhouse, and now I understand that Doc Waters saved us. When John fell, the old judge was bent on making us boys disband and scatter. But Doc Waters talked for us and told the judge we were really his junior police, so we are lucky. Shadow mused. Lucky, yes, perhaps, he said. Some of us are lucky, but poor old Rolling Stone is gone, Hawkins. He was really a fine fellow. If it hadn't been for the cliff cave, let me suggest something, will you? Let's do this before the judge tells us to. Let's go down to that cave tomorrow and seal it up tight, so that it will be closed up forevermore. Which we did. End of chapter 33. End of The Knights of the Square Table by Seckatary Hawkins.